So my opponent's claim for this speech was that video games have little effect on the increase of violent crimes. As for his secondary claims would be that the link between real violent crimes and video games has failed to be established. Video games actually promote a decrease in violent crimes, and the third one being that in turn case, because they reduce stress, they also reduce stress-related crimes. As for my responses for this, I actually will reference back his source that was on the Secret Service and Department of Education report on the School Safe Initiative, which was mainly focusing on school shootings. And the report is actually based on 37 different cases that had 41 different attackers. The reason for the whole purpose of the report was because a team used the game Doom to map out the entire school, and he did this months before he actually committed the shooting. And the key findings in the actual report were that all the attacks are not acts of impulse and all have some sort of planning, and there isn't no accurate profile of the school shooters, as well as all attackers had some sort of mentality complications with being able to cope with loss and personal failures. And even though only 12% of the actual cases for school shootings in related back to video games, the 12% of attackers that actually did show interest of violence through the video games, they used the game as a sort of an outlet for their aggression as well as a distraction, and in some cases like the Doom incidents, they used it as planning. Because the games were used as a distraction, it prolongs the school shootings, which actually is ground evidence for the strong possibility that the games were used for planning versus an actual escape per se. As for the counterclaim, the reason why games became so addicting was because they have a sort of a realistic aspect. For instance, like the GTA games, there are currently 15 different versions of Grand Theft Auto, and the whole purpose of the game is to basically act any way you want. You can rob cars, you can steal, you can be publicly intoxicated, you can even run away from law enforcement. And the fact that they have that law enforcement aspect creates that realistic association from the video games into real life, which make it more desirable and more addicting for people. An incident that actually can be referenced to the source that the attackers have mental complications with coping would be the incident that happened in Florida in Jacksonville. David Katz was a competitor in the video game competition, and he killed the champions, the first and second one, because he lost, and he went with the intent of a gun. And because he went with the intent, it just shows their difficulty and their mental instability. As for the second reasoning, he used the Cunningham study that the violent video games and violent crime. But actually in the study, it states that however these studies cannot be account for either aggressive effects or alternative activities video games playing substitute for, or the possible selection of relatively violent people into playing the video games, meaning that the case immediately eliminates anyone who has a past of violence, as well as those who use video games as a substitute. By removing this, it immediately removes a very crucial population of the video gamers, and it also suggests that it's removing actually in the thing it said that it also, the whole purpose of the case was that it reduces crime, but it was said as it was used as a distraction versus it being prolonged. But because the games were actually prolonged, it can actually be seen versus because it was a distraction that it was used to satisfy their violent behaviors versus actually acting them out. But because it's a distraction, it can only be distracted for so long, which would explain the decrease, but then back increase into the violent crimes rate. As for the third one, it says that it reduces stress, which can reduce stress-related crimes, and he used the Hitman study, which was by Chris Ferguson's, but in the actual study, it states that It is possible that the exposure to video games in real life may have influence on aggression, hostile feelings, and depression outcomes. As we augmented the randomization design of the quantum experimental design with the real-life violent video games exposure as the main independent variable, this note cannot be used for the following results in correlation of nature and should not be taken to infer causality because they do not benefit from random assignment, meaning they don't have the real-life scenario and it wouldn't necessarily be beneficial because the relationship between violent crimes and violent video games depends on the individual's mental stability and their use of the game. That would be the actual connection between the two. As well as the case was only conducted with college students and majority of them being Hispanic, it eliminates and creates a limitation of other ethnic groups and other age groups, which would be excluding like adolescents, who are also a big population of the gamer community. As for the counter argument for this particular one would be the video games and hostile experiment, which was by Brad Bushman, which tested two groups, giving them either violent or non-violent video games and asked to describe the main characters of a story they were presented afterwards, their feelings, actions, and thought. And the study found that the people who played the violent video games described the main character as more aggressive and angry versus those of the non-violent video games. And the study also infers that the video games can influence a person's way on how they think and their feelings towards their feelings. This actually demonstrates the connection of video games and the mental state of the player, which can lead to the confusion when it comes to the extreme cases of violent video games with violent crimes. Because it allows for the reality to be intermixed between video games and reality, and because they already have difficulties coping with loss and they're easily frustrated, the result is the violent crimes. But because there's like most of the studies did not come from the mental state of the actual individual versus the mass majority, it would prove otherwise that the violent video games are actually the result of the violent crimes are actually the result of violent video games.
All right, well, so much of what you've presented is focused on looking at the studies and rather than on the claims that the advocate's presenting, it gets a little confusing as to what the consequence is if you're correct in the criticism of the study, or if you are suggesting that the study reaches an opposite conclusion from what the advocate's saying it presented. That was not always clear. I felt a little bit like, especially in the first 2/3 of the presentation, like I was being caught up in the minutia of information about the research without necessarily knowing what it is in the long run that you want me to believe on these particular points. Let's summarize it in the simplest way possible for an oral presentation. The studies that are mentioned do in fact show that there is a relationship, that the studies show that the relationship is primarily one that affects people who are unbalanced to begin with, and that we have no way of predicting who is not going to be affected or who is going to be affected, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a relationship. That seems to be kind of the point that you're making, at least on that first point. And in the long run, I'm saying, okay, so that means what in relationship to their argument? Are they wrong or are they right? Or can we not tell? I think you're saying that we can't really tell, which doesn't really refute the argument, but does suggest that we can't reach the conclusion with any degree of confidence. On the issue of decreasing crime, we get 2 points that are kind of related to each other. The crime is going to decrease as a result of this, primarily because it reduces stress. And once again, we get this discussion of the studies and how they're inadequate in controlling for a variety of factors, that there are distractions that are included in this process. I'm going, okay, so what does this lead me to conclude? I'm not sure I could say very clearly what it is that it's leading me to conclude. I don't think of myself as a unreasonably unintelligent person. I just think that for an oral presentation, if you can't make a declarative sentence that tells me what the argument is and why your argument matters, we've gotten lost in the grass, so to speak. I think that that's kind of happened on some of these points. As a critique of evidence that's being used by both sides, I can see that you are pulling information here that is important, but what conclusion I should be drawing for that information, that's the thing that I think is not being communicated, and that's really what we need to get to. And so even though there's an extensive analysis of the evidence, which I did think was convincing that you knew what the heck it was that you were talking about, I don't know what the heck you want me to believe as a result of what you know. And that's the thing that is problematic. All right, I'm going to stop there.